Welcome to Mustard State Studio's advanced class on Melodyne 4 Studio and Editor versions inside of Studio One. I'm going to cover some worst case scenario tempo mappings, as you see me highlighting here, as well as how to do tempo mapping with multitracks and tempo mapping with MIDI instruments. There's a lot of mapping techniques in this class, so I need you to pause the video to practice them one at a time. Time did not permit all examples, nor did the songs actually produce all the examples, so such things as changes in time signatures and suspending songs where there's gaps are not actually demonstrated here, as well as any of the secondary mapping techniques such as creating smoothing or retarding once you get an accurate map is not included in this course. In order to get us started, I'm going to quickly review some key points of the beginning class. The first thing is to turn on the inspector to see the details. Then you want to make sure that you're in bar mode. And after that, you need to turn off cursor follows edits. And you notice I'm going to set the time stretch to don't follow. Now I'm going to line up beat 1 in the song to any measures beat 1 in Studio One. After it's done processing, you might want to check that use the proper algorithm. The polyphonic algorithms are much more accurate in terms of detecting tempo. The next step is very important. In order to enable the tempo map, you must click the assign note and then the option button to view the tempo map. The next step is to verify your time signature is correct. If it's not, you can just click it and type in a new one. And you should also verify that your tempo is reasonable. It could be off by 2x or 1/2, and you can just click the drop down to select a new one. Now we'll verify and fine-tune the first beat of the song. This is actually a pretty critical step here. You notice if I move the first beat using the time signature, it only moves in increments of the time signature. If I try to move the first beat using the timeline, it only uses the subdivisions defined in the tempo here. In order to solve this problem, to line up to that exact downbeat, I've got to set the subdivisions to something smaller. I will go ahead, adjust it to 32 just temporarily here to help make the fine-tune adjustment. And if need be, I can just slightly nudge it over using the freeform option at the bottom. And then I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 16 because 16 subdivisions, a 16th note is usually good enough for fixing things at that point. So one of the things you're going to want to develop a habit of is not using Studio One's transport, but using Melodyne's transport mechanism along with its metronome. This is because you want that tick to go along and be telling you exactly where the bars are, versus this tick may be aligned to an older map, which is not quite right yet. So as you're refining your map, you're going to want to always use this metronome. Now, unfortunately, this metronome doesn't remember its volume level. So each time you open up the tempo map, you're going to have to reset this to a level that you can hear. So let's listen to what it sounds like. And I'm going to double click here to launch the play. And then one click to stop. So that's the process you got to learn. And it really helps out to kind of get your brain locked into where the downbeats are. Now let's get comfortable with a couple of the commands in the tempo map area. First one is the zooming, to zoom the scales. So you notice we've got zoom at the top here, zoom at the bottom, and in the center is a drag. So you can drag it up and down or zoom it. So zoom it this way or that way, exaggerating the differences in the timing. And you can double click it to reset it. The area above the tempo line is used to select things. So I will highlight a little area here and drag it up and down and show you that it only affects that area that has been highlighted. This is probably the most important part here, is below the timeline, you really have two different tools. We have what's called a quantized movement, where the movements are going to be in small quantization movements, and it's based off of the number you hear over here in the segment level. And the bottom one is, you see where it goes into the cursor, is allows you to free form adjust, and so it just shifts and manipulates everything around it based off your movement, and there's no quantization. So this is like having snap off, if you will, in the timing thing. So normally what I would recommend you do is once you've lined up beat one, and you kind of try to make it work with the small quantization moves. So to recap, zoom, move, select, upper half quantize moves, lower half snap off. Let's just try our hand at some tempo mapping now. And what I'm doing is I'm listening and watching at the same time, so it's a good idea just to watch like bass lines, kick drums. Those are typically more on beat. You're looking for blobs that will be on beat, so like this blob, that blob. Let's just listen to those. Kind of go through it and listen till we hear something that's wrong. You hear what I just did there? My left hand hit the space bar, which you get so used to doing. That starts this guy running, and you start hearing his ticking track, so you want to make sure you're doing the double click. We're a little bit behind there, so here's the beat, and there's the line, so move in there a little bit, so you can kind of just see what I'm doing there. I'm going to do a quantize move over to that, and that's going to shift everything to the right, 16th of a note, and it makes this one a little bit closer here. We'll just come back with it a little bit there and see what that sounds like. There it is right there. Watch what happens when I highlight this note here. It's not going to scroll. Believe it or not, that is a feature of Melodyne. They're keeping you from losing track of the note of the blob you were editing. So whenever you scrolling stops working for you, just make sure that you don't have any blobs highlighted. And the way you do that is you just click off the blob. Okay, so now we're at the end of a segment. So these are called tempo segments, and you usually get a lot of them in a song. You see quite a few of them there. A lot of them are what's called superfluous. In other words, it tried to make an adjustment. It went from 159 to 153 to 134. The song is slowing down, and it thinks it needs to make some adjustments there, and it threw those different segments in there. More often than not, they're not needed. They're superfluous, so you go ahead and delete them. The way you delete them is you click on the line. And watch what happens here when I do that. It smooths out. I'm going to actually do it on this one here too. Click above the line, double click. Watch that 134 go away. Now it's dropped this thing down to 156 instead of 159. It's kind of averaged out all of them. So somewhere along here we're probably missing a beat, but we'll go ahead and figure that later on. So let's go back to where we were at. Okay, so we're off beat by there. So remember, I'm grabbing the top part of this thing, not the bottom part, because I want to do quantize moves. Okay, so we're way off here. We're like a beat and a half off here, because there's the downbeat right here. And, you know, the line's here. So let's just go back and see where we fell off the... Let's just drag this over. And that's when through in that segment is when it was missing a beat. We got so far behind that it dropped the beat. So I think that one is there. And this one here is here. I'm looking at that area, looking at that syncopated note there in the beginning of this one. To do a very radical move. Why? Because here's the end of a segment, and it can't move. It can't do any adjustments beyond that segment. So let's kind of do a Control Z here to back that out. We know that this beat needs to be there, but since it's tied down to this stake in the ground here, we need to get rid of that stake in the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and double click that. If you want to actually just use your arrow keys, you can go boom, downbeat there, lined up to this, arrow over. I'm trying to follow the bass line. Okay, there's the downbeat right there. So this guy's got to go over to there. But let's just walk the bass line. That's the downbeat right there. You see it's starting to get back to that 160 beat per minute thing, because it got off a beat. And that's why I threw that extra segment in there. That sounds better. This is a downbeat right here. Probably find one down here too, yeah. And so that guy needs to move way over there. And when we do that, guess what? It starts to get level again. Going for that downbeat. I love how this thing adjusts things. It just smooths it all out. Tries to make an average out of it, because it's based on the theory that the musician wants to keep good time. Whenever you get lost, you know, look for a good downbeat, you know, and well, you know, you can kind of anchor yourself back again. So here's an example where a tempo segment is off by quite a bit. I mean, the song is run along at 160 beats per minute, and this guy's sitting at 117, so not realistically going to happen. Let's kind of listen to what's going on with the music here. Okay, so the bass goes into some whole notes there, but that probably somehow confused it there. So what we're going to do is we're going to see what's the closest beat they have to 160, which is 157. So we'll go ahead and select that, and that at least puts it in the range. Then we're actually going to go ahead and remove the segment, and this one too. And now we're close. Now we're back onto that 160. Okay. So basically the group's kind of speeding up in that little break there. That's typical when you're holding on a note like that and the guy's singing longer notes. The group. And we're back on beat around 160. So that's an example of completely off in timing. We try to get it to the closest possible one, remove the edges of it, and smooth it out. Here's another little tip that might help some of you. Go under Note Editor and select Highlight Notes During Playback. That way you get kind of a visual feedback on which one of the polyphonic notes is actually being played. Okay, so you can see where we're starting to line up to a wrong beat here, and we're getting a huge change in tempo. This isn't real because we're basically skipped a beat somewhere along the line. So in other words, we lost our downbeat. Okay, there it is right there. Looking at that one. So using all those techniques we just went through, now you see what the tempo map looks like. This is the same song that we showed at the beginning of the tutorial. Considerably more accurate tempo map. Now we're going to take a look at multi-track tempo mapping. Now there's some things you need to think about when working with multi-tracks. For instance, where is the beat? The beat might be the drums. It might be the drums in its entirety. In other words, let's say the song starts off with a tom-tom fill, so the kick's not really going to be there, so the kick wouldn't be the most predominant thing. So it might take a combination of all the drums to actually figure out where the tempo is. Or it might be a song that starts off with a rhythm guitar, and then drums come in, and then you're going to want the rhythm guitar to represent the tempo from a certain part of the song until the drums kick in. And worst case, if it's not obvious who all's carrying the rhythm, then you may want to actually do a guide mix of the entire song to use for your tempo map, and that's what I typically do. Turns out that Melodyne actually works better with more data, so the more it has to analyze, bass guitars, kick drums, etc., as blobs in terms of the tempo, usually the better it does. And then there's a couple of tricks that are involved with lining up the song to an even measure and within the DAW, so that when you're done, the tempo track will align the DAW's tick to the downbeats that you want. So we'll take a look at a few little tricks in terms of how to line that up. Okay, let's take a look at the song that we've been listening to, and it is a multi-track song. It's actually, I played all the tracks on this song. Some of them are okay, and some of them are really bad. So, for instance, you would think, well, let's use the drums to set the tempo. But I did this probably about 15 years ago, or even longer ago. But let's listen to the drums and how bad they are. I mean, it's just me playing the drums on the keyboard. So it's got all sorts of quantization issues, timing issues. Not a good drum track to base a song after. And so then let's listen to the guitars. Not bad, but they're not real tight. So what I ended up doing here is kind of going through and listening to all the different parts. And I just decided I'm going to use I basically just took all the tracks in the song, mixed them down, ended up doing the whole tempo map that we just looked at. So that's an example where sometimes it's just easier to just use the entire song in a multi-track situation as your ruler. Remember, this just becomes your guide track that sets your timing for the entire song. So think of it like a ruler. I mean, basically this thing becomes that, and that's its only purpose. I mean, after that, you might as well delete that. Purely a reference track to get that tempo map that you were looking for. So that's one example of kind of worst case scenario where you got to use the entire mix to really get the good strong mix of the entire song. Let's take a look at another one. Here's a song that you'll probably be familiar with or recognize. So it's got good solid drums starting off. So this song had a good enough drum track to it to just use the drum track to it. So on this one, I went ahead and used the drums as my tempo guideline, if you will. And when I open this up amplify this out just to show you that, this is a very tight rhythmic group, Steely Dan, and this is showing you just how much variation and feel and move is in a hit song. That, this is normal. This is good. In other words, just don't think if you start seeing a lot of bumps and grinds on your song that you got a problem. You may not. It just may be the feel of the song. But my point of that here is we're not going to be going in and lining up note by note things here. If I expand it out, it's very easy for Melodyne to go through and lock onto a set of drums. Usually you're not going to run anywhere close to the problems that we just went through in that worst case scenario of how to map out all the idiosyncrasies of a strange map. Now that we've looked at different ways to determine guide tracks, looking at the content of your music to determine the best guide track to build your tempo map off of, let's take a look at some of the steps you've got to do in terms of aligning it and grouping those tracks and making sure that they're always in sync so you don't get them out of sync once you start moving things in terms of tempo. Here we have a Melodyne tempo guide track. This is the one that we developed our tempo map from, which was, in the case of this song, was just the drums. Now let's go ahead and take a closer look at that. We want to make sure that the guide track is set to don't follow. You want that track to stay still, not move, and it becomes the anchor point for the entire song. So you're basically getting the computer to follow that tempo track, and so you want it to stay stationary. In contrast, though, the actual multi-tracks of the song, you want those to be set to stretch. You want those to follow the tempo map once you get the tempo map established. So you'll want to go ahead and set those to time stretch. And let's take a look at a little more discrete look at the process here. In order to do any kind of manipulation of this multi-track session, you want to make sure that you've locked in sync with a group, Control G command to lock all your multi-tracks always in sync. So when you move them, they all move together. The guitars, vocals, everything moves in association with where they were originally at in relative movement. Because we're going to go ahead and start shifting this thing around to line up to the tempo grid. And we want to go for a particular, in this case, we want to drag it to align it to a beat 1 of a bar. Here I show you, lining it up to, say, bar number 9 in this particular example. And we want to make sure we're dragging the entire song so we don't, get musicians out of sync with each other. After you've done your tempo mapping, as we've done earlier in the class, learned, and when you're verified that you're good with it, in this case, Melodyne produced a perfect tempo map with no intervention. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag that up to Studio One and apply it to the Studio One's tempo track. And then there's a couple of other housekeeping things you need to make sure you check with your song. And it's situational. So if your song was recorded in Studio One, odds are all your multi-tracks have tempos associated with them. And Studio One needs a tempo data in order to do any kind of time stretching. If it doesn't find a file tempo, it won't do any stretching. Those files will stay where they're at. So to solve that problem, what you want to do is bounce every one of your multi-tracks once. And what that will do is it will print or it will write that existing tempo map that you've applied up here in Studio One's tempo track and write it into every one of the files in the multi-track. And it'll basically show up as a mapped setting. In other words, it's taking all those hundreds of variations in tempo and writing them actually into every one of the files in your multi-track. And at that point, you've got a pretty solid multi-track tempo ready song. You can then do all sorts of cool things, such as, let's say you wanted to make the tempo absolutely flat. You can still keep the exact feel of the entire group together and change the overall tempo of the song, smooth it out, make it absolutely flat, ramp it up, ramp it down, whatever you want to do. And also, because you're now totally locked into the grid of Studio One, all of your quantization commands will work much better. Quantizations of drums, musicians to each other, everything now has a reference, which is now your reference track. is now applicable to the entire live performance. So that's kind of the steps to doing multi-track tempo mapping. It's a little more involved. The next thing I want to do is actually talk about the tempo mapping of MIDI instruments. So in this scenario, we have a MIDI performance that was recorded in Studio One as if it was a tape recorder, and we're going to set that track to seconds to lock it down. Seconds is equivalent to setting it to don't follow on an audio track. And then we'll align the beats, kind of visually align the first beat of the song, and then we'll go in and transform that MIDI to audio, then apply Melodyne to it, and go in and confirm the tempo map and into the audio file. Then we'll drag that tempo map out of the audio file onto Studio One's tempo track. Then we'll retransform that back into a MIDI track, and we'll verify that our track is set back to beats instead of seconds. And then we're going to go ahead and confirm that the tempo track and the tick is aligned with the MIDI performance. And if you need be, you repeat as many times as you want. Each time you kind of refine it, you get a little bit closer. Get it perfectly lined up, but eventually you'll get it lined up, and then you have a performance that you can go ahead and keep at that tempo, or you can smooth it out. Let's take a look at that. And notice I've got it time-based to seconds, so there's no stretching. This just happened to be sitting at 118. This song don't know what tempo it is, but so let's go ahead and map that. The next thing I'm going to do is transform it. Now here we have audio and MIDI. The reason I transform it is that I want to be able to come back to the MIDI when I'm done here. Melodyne has to work on only the audio signals, so this is kind of the best of both worlds. Then I just apply Melodyne to it. And we'll go in and look at the tempo map. Here's a step that I didn't show you in the other detailed editing video, and this is in the MIDI track that I'm trying to tempo map. Listen to the downbeats. 1, 1, 1. Okay, so there's a 1, right? The part starts over again. So there's a half measure here. Either it's a half measure in terms of how it was written, or the piano player didn't actually play the last 2 beats of the measure. Either way, we need to get this downbeat to land on that downbeat. So how do we do that? So there's a couple ways. One is we could reduce this tempo to the point where measure 16 lined up, or we could insert a half measure though. So let's try inserting a half measure. So one of the things I didn't show you is if you double click on this, remember we were double clicking up here to remove segments. If you double click down here, you can add a segment. See, so we just cut that in half and added a segment there. So we could add a segment there, and we could add a segment here. Now we've got this little half measure thing here that we could change the tempo on. So I'm going to add in a different beat here. And then I'm going to add in a 4/4 here. Okay, so what we ended up with here is 4/4 coming up to here. Measure 15, and then a 1/2, basically a half measure, and then 4/4 starting up again. Let's see what it sounds like. Then we start over. That's how you add segments to kind of fill in where the whole band added a half a measure, or a beat here, a beat there that's not what you would expect. See, here's an example where she actually played out the 2 extra beats in terms of the measure. That's probably how it was supposed to be. Sometimes people tend to leave those things out. We need to, remember where we had that little half measures in there, we need to actually put the same half measures in Studio One if you want it to follow on exactly. So now if you drag in different parts here, different musicians and drum beats and drum loops and stuff, that will totally sync to that live performance. So next thing we need to do is, once we're kind of satisfied with that, we're going to transform it back to an instrument. If I wanted to fix something, I'm just using this as an example. If I went into quantization here and put this on 16th and, back this way down and the range way down here. So we would just barely be, just kind of give an example here. So, you can fix the actual live performance of the piano right to the grid now, because the grid's following the piano player exactly. And it also makes it very good for producing sheet music. Now we can take this song out, now that it's completely aligned to the grid like that, and you can drag it over into Notion, and you're going to get some pretty good looking sheet music. You're going to get sheet music that looks pretty close to what the musician was looking at when they were performing this. There again is another example of why tempo mapping is such a powerful tool to kind of go forwards, backwards, MIDI world, the audio world, the notation world, the live performance world, kind of allows you to glue all those together. So how do you tempo map MIDI from another DAW? You simply export out the MIDI track that you want to be your guide track. Then you open that file in Studio One as a new song. When you do that, Studio One will calculate the original tempo. Now this tempo will be wrong, just like the original DAW's tempo was wrong. But since they're both equal, the actual performance will play back at the right tempo. Then you go through the steps that have been identified in the class. Thank you very much from Mustard Seed Studio, and we hope you make some beautiful music.